happened, and I believe my oldest daughter was that princess.
Wow, that is an incredible story.
It really is, because it's unusual, and it's not typically part of Native American culture, and the chiefs had gotten together because there were 4 or 5 of them who had daughters who were eligible to fulfill this prophecy, to give her life, and the chiefs had said no, as did the people, and they had said, we're not going to ask one of our young women to do that. But Multnomah had chosen to do it on her own without anyone knowing or being able to stop her once she saw that her fiancé had fallen ill. He did recover, and the illness stopped taking the people. So it was quite interesting, because that's not a normal disease progression either. So it's really quite a legend and quite a story.
Wendy, tell us about Othello, Washington, and your marriage there to a writer and a gentleman farmer.
Yes. Othello, Washington is a tiny little town kind of in central Washington state, and it's very, very small now, and it was certainly not even a town when I had a past life there in the 1800s. And I was a female writer, married to a writer, and we were farmers. We were what would be called gentlemen farmers now, where we were able to pretty easily grow most of our own food and trade with neighbors, and would purposefully grow some different crops to trade with neighbors. And we went on a day trip there because we just wanted to explore, had we really had that past life, because we had been told about it by a wonderful friend who's very psychic and does a great job of auto-writing messages from her guides. And she had learned about this life, and she had been a friend with us in another couple. So we were actually 2 couples, so 4 of us on neighboring farms, 2 men and 2 women. And it just was such a marvelous life. I just remember it with a lot of fondness because of the simplicity of it, the camaraderie of it, and just being able to write full-time and support ourselves fairly easily. And for whatever reason, none of us had children that life. So I'm sure we scripted it that way to really just focus on writing and just having what I'd kind of call a rest life, too, is another term for it. And so it was just very appealing to go out there. And once I was finally able to figure out where this life had been, because that was not clear to us from her auto writing. She wasn't sure if it was in the Pacific Northwest or if it was in Europe or where this life had been. But once I figured out, I thought it was in Othello, everything again just fell into place really easily. And we decided to start our day by going to the local cemetery. And there were several, but I was really drawn to one. It just felt like the right place to start. But we couldn't quite get to it. We just kept driving, and we're on this little rural highway, one car each direction, and we could see it to our right, but we just couldn't get to this darn cemetery. So we'd go to the next stop sign and make a right again, trying to work our way around to get to it, and we just couldn't get there. It was very odd. So I turned the car around and went back the other way. It's well, we know we could see the cemetery from route whatever, so we went back that way, and I could see my GPS kept taking me back to this tiny little, I'll call it a cow path. It was like a little switchback road off the highway where farm equipment would go, like where you would get your tractor back onto your farmland. So that's all it was this like little tiny rutted road, not meant for cars at all. And I couldn't figure out how else to get to the cemetery. So it's like, well, hello, I have an SUV. We're going off-road here because it's the only way I can figure out to get to the cemetery. And my friend who was with me, he's looking at me like, what is wrong with you? You can't drive there. It's like, yes, I can. It will just go really slow. I'm sure I can drive there. It was summer. It was perfectly dry. It wasn't muddy. It's like, we're not going to get stuck. So he's arguing with me, and I'm already driving it. And we end up going along the edge of the cemetery, and then all we can see as we go down, literally down this cow path, all we can see on the other side is corn. It's just a big field of corn. And I'm like looking at that and looking at that, and I'm like, oh, that feels familiar, but I'm still focused on how do I get into the cemetery. So we get to the end of the cow path, and I finally find the correct road that we should have been on to get into the cemetery. But as we pull into the cemetery, we're so disappointed because we can see a sign saying it was established in 1962 or something like that. So way too new a cemetery to be useful to us, because we were trying to find our own graves because we knew our name, and it had been the 1800s, so we thought, that's recent enough. Maybe we can find our actual markers or, some other name that we recognize. So we pull in and park because we're there, and I don't really understand why we're there, but it just felt so purposeful, and it just felt like we were supposed to be there because the GPS kept sending me back, and I felt like my guides wanted us to be there. So I just started reading all the markers. I'm just walking around, and my friend Simon, who was in my first book in Regression Healing 1, I believe he was my husband in that life, so he went on the trip with me that day. And he's just reading the cemetery reader board and trying to call people to get more information of that family last name to see if anybody remembered them. But again, it's like, why are we here? And I suddenly noticed I kept hearing an owl. So, and that seemed odd to me because I don't usually hear owls during the day. I mean, I know they can be out in the day, but usually they're more nocturnal. So I just started trying to find the tree that the owl was in. And I realized everywhere I was walking, I'm looking back at that cow path, and I'm looking at that cornfield. And all of a sudden, I got it. And my guides are like, do you get it yet? I'm like, am I looking at my own farm? And they said yes. And I just felt so tearful because what a cool experience to get to actually find where you'd lived. I mean, it was so, I don't want to say random, but I think it was such an unusual experience and cool experience to get to actually find it. And I think that's why I was so drawn to go to that cemetery, because that was the way to get me there.
Mm-hmm. You've had so many amazing experiences with all of that.
Yes, definitely. And I feel we're all absolutely blessed and able to have experiences like that. I don't feel there's anything special or unique that I'm doing. I mean, psychic mediums are able to do wonderful things like this all the time, but any of us who are just willing to try and connect with our guides and to listen and then to take some action and to be willing to go somewhere even when you don't really know why, just to be willing to be spontaneous and to be kind of unscripted. For heaven's sakes, I was just simply taking a day to go to a town I'd never been to before. This is a low risk thing. This is an easy thing to do. And if I was wrong, I was wrong. I would have been just fine with that. If nothing resonated for me or nothing looked or felt familiar, I would have been fine with that. You just have to let go of the outcome too. but it really was a cool experience. And when we were going home that day, it had just been super, super hot, well over 100 degrees, which for we Seattleites is super hot. Not to you, Rich, but for us. And unfortunately, my air conditioning had broken on the car that day, so we were just roasting. So Simon fell asleep in the passenger seat of the car, which just freed me up as we're driving home. I was just able to really talk with my guides, and I said, okay, if we really had a past life here recently, and I have the details correct of who we were and what that life was about, would you please just show me a sign? I just like to understand and to validate and confirm what I just saw, and that I think we found our farm, and so on and so forth. And so I just made that request and just let it go, and just kept on driving with the windows open, and hot. And very quickly, like within 1 to 2 minutes, I heard look from my guides. So I looked around really sharply, because I'm making sure there's no car to avoid or animal to avoid. When you hear look like that, I'm really looking. But what I saw instead was the next exit, one that we needed to take, but I saw the name of the next exit. And it said it was the town of Preston. And the meaning of the word Preston to me was Preston was the name of my female friend in that lifetime. And that's not a typical name. I mean, it's probably a family surname. She'd probably been named for the last name. But for a woman to be named Preston, and what were the odds for me to suddenly see the town of Preston, which I'd never heard of, and we drove home a different way. We decided to take a different road to just see if, any more new experiences, and routed a little bit differently going home. So I had not, seen it on the way in and forgotten it, because we were going a different way. But I thought that was cool.
From the universe, wasn't it?
Yes, I thought that was such a cool validation. And while we were there that day too, Othello's a play written by Shakespeare, and we found a neighborhood where the developers had, played on that and just had some fun with it. It was a new development, but they had named most of the streets from things to do with Shakespeare's life. And that was really, really interesting to me too, because I was hearing a lot of validation from a past life in the time of Shakespeare, which is something I'd had a question about. And it just kind of made perfect sense to, piggyback that off that other unrelated. Well, I guess actually it's not an unrelated life, because both were to do with writing. So it's not completely unrelated. So.
You had an unusual number of lives in Mount Shasta, California. Tell us about that.
Yes, Mount Shasta, California is amazing. It's beautiful. The vibration, the energy is very unique, very high, and I've found quite a few lives there. I found another native life there. I found a life as a preschool teacher there. I found several lives there. But one of the most interesting experiences I had the good fortune to be introduced to a shaman, and he agreed to meet with us. And shaman are just very, very interesting people, and a lot are fairly reclusive and just very quiet in the work that they do. But he had agreed to meet with us, and once he met with the two friends and I, he just looked at us as we were, and he even invited us to his home, which I thought was very kind. He had a small farm, and he had asked us if we were animal lovers, and I said, yes, all three of us are. He said, well, then great, come meet at my house, rather than us meeting out in a coffee shop somewhere. Come to my house where we had some privacy, and we'll just meet and talk and get to know each other a little bit, and you can see my animals. So that's what we did. And as we were walking over this big porch on his house, and he was opening the door and greeting us for the first time, and when we went in, about 15 minutes later, he said, I've been waiting a long time for the three sisters to show up, and I was told in a prophecy that I would meet you this lifetime, and I've been waiting a long, long time. So we just thought that was just really special and really cool for him to validate that the three of us had quite a few lives together, because we had known that, but for him to immediately pick up on that and welcome us in such a personal way was very cool. And as we spent an hour or two with him that day, he asked why we had come to Mount Shasta, and I told him one of the main reasons was I had been called there to help, if it was appropriate, because I'm very careful and very respectful of Mother Nature and Mother Earth, and where there's rainfall and where there's not rainfall. But I told him we were open to helping bring the rain back to California, because there had been a 4 or 5 year drought, if that was appropriate. So we phrased it as divine right rainfall, was the way we put it to him. And he looked at us and he said, that's exactly right, that, you understand the concept. So what we agreed to do was he would do a ceremony with us the last night that we were there, to ask for the right amount of rain to return in the best places, the best times, because you don't want too much rain all at once either, or you end up with flash floods and problems in a different arena. But we went, and he took us deep into the woods. That is the only time my car has ever been off-road again, other than the short little trek in Othello. So evidently I don't off-road unless something, spiritual, past life, energetic is going on. It's the only time I off-road. And he led us, he had a truck with a really high bed, and he led us into the woods, way into the woods, and the road had completely washed out. So I am just praying that I'm not going to break an axle at this point, because it was just the roughest, worst terrain I had ever driven on. So we get deep, deep, deep into the woods at this place he'd selected, and it was just gorgeous. And it was maybe an hour or so before sunset was what he'd chosen as being a powerful time. And he had built a big circle with many, many rocks that he had found, and he built a special ceremonial fire pit in the center of it that went up very, very high, because in time of drought like that, only a shaman or a native is allowed to, have a very, very small ceremonial fire, and, the utmost protection has to be taken to fully make sure that it goes out, of course, because of the risk of fire. But he had made this location for us. So we get there and we pull in behind his truck, and I'm literally like wiping my forehead from oh my God, I'm glad my car made it and we got here, and oh goodness, I have to do that in the dark to go out. But we're just going to enjoy this ceremony. And so there was a shaman, an assistant shaman, who was in training with him, and then there were 3 of us that were going to be in this ceremony, and one of us was going to be earth, air, water, and fire. So one of the shaman was going to play the 4th part for us. But the big surprise was, as we get there, and you can just clearly see this is being set up for some sort of ceremony with what he had built. But there's this tent. There's this